All right. Hello. Welcome to episode 6 of A Farm Girl Goes to Boston. I'm here with Mom again today. Hi, Mom.
Hi.
Today on our episode, we are finally getting to Boston in
Yes.
Farm Girl. So, without further ado, let's hop right in. I found a sign of Andover Newton Theological Seminary. And my question for you is, since you had met Dad and gotten married in our last episode, you were in Washington State studying at Whitworth College. What took you across the country to go to Andover Newton?
Our adventurous spirits. We both agreed that he, as a guy from Southern California, me as a farm girl from Colorado, we needed to have experience living in the sophistication of the East Coast. And maybe graduate school was a good way to get that experience. And so we did. And I literally felt when we crossed the Mississippi River, that was the first time flying. We were flying, and I looked down and I saw the Mississippi River, and I felt like I was on the other side of the seesaw, that I'd always been on the western side of the seesaw, and now I was on the eastern side of the seesaw. So it was a big deal for us. It was a big move.
Okay, and what is Andover Newton?
Okay, so Andover Newton at the time was a combined United Church of Christ, American Baptist Seminary, which meant it was pretty liberal. Also, it was part of a consortium of theological schools in the Boston area, which meant that Terry had professors from Harvard, or he could go to Harvard Divinity School and other theological schools in the area.
So he had finished at Whitworth and then was continuing at Andover Newton?
Correct, in Newton Center, just a little bit west of Boston proper.
Okay, so he was pursuing a theological degree, and what were you doing?
I had transferred to Boston University, which, can we go to that next picture?
Yeah.
Of the BU chapel.
Mm-hmm.
So that BU chapel is right in the middle of the kind of city campus of Boston University, half of the campus on one side, half on the other. And when I said going to the East Coast was a really big thing, just imagine that I was going as a senior in college from this very religiously conservative, tiny liberal arts college out on the very northern edge of Spokane, Washington, covered with pine trees. And I ended up in the middle of Boston, and in the middle of Boston University, in the middle of the 1960s.
Wow.
Yeah. And so when you kind of titled this A Farm Girl Goes to Boston, I mean, it was huge. It was just huge. And for both of us, it was really liberating. So can I tell you about a couple of people at BU?
Yes, tell me about a couple of people at BU.
Okay. The first one is Howard Zinn. He was my history professor. Now, all I knew at the time was that I was in a fairly small senior seminar type class with him. And what I sensed on the part of the other students was that they revered him. I was kind of like, okay, who is this guy that these students just are in awe of? Well, from time to time, students would come in and interrupt in the middle of class, and he would consult with them just kind of in whispers right in the class. And so I finally at one point said to one of my classmates, so who are these people coming in? And he said, well, Howard Zinn is a consultant, a counselor for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was one of the prime organizations, kind of the equivalent of Black Lives Matter in the 60s, that did a lot of work with voter registration in the South. And it turns out that Howard Zinn had been a professor at Spelman College in the South, which is a Black liberal arts college for women. Mm-hmm. And I did not know any of this at the time, but people like Alice Walker were in his classes, and Marian Wright Edelman, wow. Who are just leading figures in the arts and the political sphere. And I don't know who else might have been in his classes at Spelman. Anyway, he was fired from Spelman because the administration thought he was radicalizing their proper women students, like Alice Walker and Marian Wright Edelman. And that's what took him to BU. And then it turned out at BU, his were the most popular classes. So people fought eventually to get into his classes. Well, he came there in 1964. I started in 1966 as a senior. So for me to have been able to be in one of his smaller seminar classes was very special. So this is now anti-war, civil rights. We're in the middle of the 60s, in the middle of Boston, in the middle of all these student campuses. All of the student activist stuff was going on. And I have no idea how this happened, but I became the secretary of the Newton anti-war movement group.
How did you have no idea?
I mean, I just don't remember the background of that and why someone like me coming from Spokane, Washington and Colorado was now secretary of this really pretty high-powered organization. And what I remember of one of our meetings was not that Paul Newman was at the meeting, which he was, but that Howard Zinn came to the meeting. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, why is my history professor at this meeting? And so it's just such an interesting time for me to look back on, because I was associating with people who were completely and totally invested professionally and morally in these causes. And I was just this college kid who had very little clue of what I was involved in until now. I look back on it and back on these people after the fact and think, wow. And it just almost brings me to tears. And the other piece about Howard Zinn was that in 1980, his book that was titled A People's History of the United States was one of the first history textbooks to tell American history from the viewpoint of Native peoples and people who were enslaved and other immigrant groups. And it is still used as a formative text in high school and college classrooms. And of course, he edited it over the years. I think he died in about 2010, maybe, but he was still throughout his life then eventually involved in environmental things. And anyway, and here I was, clueless as a, college kid, as a part of his, little seminar class.
Yeah, although that's why I wanted to call this series A Farm Girl Goes to Boston, because when you think back on the picture of you with your rooster and then in class with the professor, it's quite a contrast.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I don't think you give yourself enough credit for saying you don't know what you're doing. I think in my mind, you're looking back, realizing how extraordinary it was, and you happen to be in the middle of it, because it's not like you were stupid.
That's true.
You didn't know what you were doing.
Yeah, that's true. I guess maybe a lot of us look back on our youth and think, we didn't realize at the time what was happening around us and what was going on. And we have a third picture. Did you want me to say anything about Old Cambridge Baptist Church?
Yes. Yes, please do. Tell us about the church.
Okay, so this is where Terry was doing his field work. And Terry was involved in his own version of all these things I've described about me and Howard Zinn. Because when Terry was working at Old Cambridge Baptist Church, the head of staff was a man named Ernie Klein. And Ernie Klein led this church in ministries to street people when those kinds of things weren't being really done yet. He was affirming women's leadership roles, trying to make a dent in the tremendously masculine church language, to use more gender inclusive language in church worship. He was very involved in civil rights. And the church became part of the sanctuary movement, which at the time was also very controversial. And the way it used its sanctuary was to shield anti-war demonstrators. So Terry was working in this congregation that with a Baptist minister who was pretty controversial and kind of taking a lot of chances in leadership in these same kinds of issues at the time. So we were both just jazzed up by all of these things because, even though Terry came from Los Angeles, he came from a pretty privileged background in Southern California, or not privileged so much economically because both of our families were working class families, but from a protected kind of naive place in terms of his family background, and then in terms of our time at Whitworth College, and then boom, here we are both in Boston at this amazing time. And in both of our cases, we were in environments where there was very strong leadership on the very cutting edge of all of these issues.
So you made it to Boston, and your life exploded with all these things happening around you because of what was happening in the world in the 60s. And yes.
And there's a lot more to Boston because it ended up in, when we moved, I was pregnant with your brother.
Oh, okay. Well, you had to start somewhere.
Yeah. Those were the early years. Early
well,
part of our time in Boston.
That's an excellent segue into what we'll talk about next.
Yes.
All right. Well, on that note, thanks for the introduction to how you got to Boston and what the climate was like when you got there. So
yeah.
We'll continue again next time.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.